Okay, so the next step, you guys, is to install the front cover in the oil pan. One of the things that I would encourage you to do is rotate the engine and make sure nothing is hitting the windage tray or anything like that down here. We just want to rotate this and listen. Make sure you don't have any connecting rods contacting, any crank throws contacting this aftermarket windage tray. And I actually could not find anyone in town that had these. I had to special order these overnight to get them here. These just go into the block here, and these are really vitally important because what they help to center that seal on this shaft here. If you don't put these in, you could have a major seal leak here. It's a good idea to use a gasket sealer on this gasket. I use RTV on it between the block and the gasket. Just go ahead and get your gasket on there. Let that set up a little bit, and then we can just put our front cover straight on there. Now there's a couple of studs that go in here. Alright guys, so we've also got some RTV on the new cover here. We've got our seal installed, and also make sure that you lube that seal. Put some assembly lube or something on that seal. Don't put it in dry. Now we've got a couple of studs coming out of the front of the engine here. And then at that point, you guys, you just very carefully slide your front cover onto the these are the factory studs here. And the locating dowels up here on those bottom bolt holes will help locate this thing. So just want to get onto those locating dowels. These are the original bolts we took out. Get those in. You can hand tight these and it'll pull that cover up onto those dowel pins. And anytime you have an aluminum component, you always want to use flat washers on here. So just snug these up real gently here. There's only 4 fasteners that hold this on. You want to just snug them up just slightly more than hand tight here. And make sure that that front cover is flush up against the block all the way around. And this one is, it looks good. And now that you get to that point, we can go ahead and torque these fasteners to specs. Alright, now on the oil pan gasket, you guys, I always put a bit of adhesive on the block, not too much. And I just kind of bolt this down strategically, and I let it set up, and I line up the bolt holes, and I let that gasket stick to the block. And also in the corners where the gaskets intersect in the front and in the back where you have this rubber piece, you're going to want to put a blob of silicone before you put the pan on in each one of the corners. But let the gasket set up first. We got our dipstick tube in and got it secured. Oil pumps on and torqued and welded. We talked about that. So yeah, I mean, the next thing is the pan gasket. I don't really like the pan gaskets that they have on these. I wish they had a one-piece Felpro gasket like they did for the Chevys, but I looked and they don't. So it is what it is. But we're getting ready to put the pan on. Another thing is, this here is your oil filter adapter. You want to clean this. We cleaned this really good in the solvent tank, and of course masked it off and painted it. Your sending unit goes in here, and there's also a spring and a check valve mechanism in here. You want to take that out. I'm going to go ahead and put it back in, but you want to take it out to clean it. You always want to make sure that these components are clean. So there's a little fiber puck that goes in there, and it just goes down and sits right over that hole right there. And then you've got a spring that goes on there. The spring just sits right on top of that puck right there. And then you've got this little tab with a bolt in it, and this just goes right over the spring. It kind of fits on the spring. And there is some tension here, so you got to kind of compress that. You got to kind of compress that spring and get the bolt started there. So I always get my nut driver on that little bolt there, and then I grab the other side with my thumb, and then I just kind of push that down and compress the spring while I get the bolt started in there with my nut driver. And this doesn't have to be super tight. it just goes in there snug. You don't want to over tighten it because it's a small bolt and you will break it. Run that down and snug up that bolt there. Get it good and snug. And that is how that piece goes. You can see that retains the spring in there. And then of course, once we get this on the vehicle, we'll put our sending unit back on here. There's a gasket that goes here. And then of course, this is gonna go right here on the side of the block, and there's a gasket that goes in between. I just put those studs in there temporarily because I needed something to hold it while I unscrewed the sending unit. We're gonna put the actual bolts that go with this back in there. Now on your filter housing, guys, I do not recommend using any kind of sealer on here. You want to keep that silicone sealer away from the oil system. So we just put our gasket on there, and these are the factory bolts that came out of here. So just get your bolts started in there with your gasket on there, and then it's just a matter of bolting the engine and then torquing the bolts. The torque's not very much on these, it's like 30 foot-pounds, and these are 3/8 bolts. So get them all started, snug them up, and torque them. And that's really basically all there is to it. Torque those up and we're in business. Alright, so now we want to turn our attention back to the pan. Now that your gasket has set up. Now like I said, where these corners are, you want to strategically place a little blob of silicone there where those gaskets meet, otherwise they could leak. Try to put it toward the outside though, keep it away from the oil sump area. And then of course, same thing on the back here where this rubber piece meets this gasket. Want to go ahead and seal that area up on both sides. And now it's just a matter of setting our pan straight down on there. And in the back here, this can be a little tricky to line up, so I always replace the bolts that go in here with these studs, and that helps me line this up. So that's what you're looking for there. And the gasket set up on here is kind of wonky, but it's the way Pontiac made it. As long as you get those 3 tabs coming through, and it's a little bit of a pain, then you can put your bolts in it and snug. Okay, so we got the pan torqued up. That pretty much does it for the bottom end. We do need to put the balancer on here. That's not a big issue. It's not a press fit. So, all right, now we turn our attention back to the top end. So one really important step here, guys, if you're running a roller lifter, make sure you soak these things in oil. Now, we're not soaking them in oil because of the hydraulic mechanism. You soak them in oil because of that roller, the needle bearing on the rollers down there. You never want those dry. So I've had these soaking for a good while now. That just ensures that oil gets in there on those needles and they're not dry during startup. Always, it's pretty much mandatory to soak those rollers. You don't have to soak flat tappets, but rollers for sure. So now that we've got to that point, we can go ahead and start installing our lifters. And basically these are the tie bar setup, and it's pretty easy. Basically just each set goes right here, and you just basically put them in. That's literally all there is to it. So once we get all the lifters in, we will start looking at this rocker arm geometry. I do not have the push rods yet, but I've got the push rod length checker, and we're gonna check the length on the push rods, and we are going to go ahead and get the push rods ordered up. Now, I've been told by multiple Pontiac purists that these guide plates are on backwards, that these are supposed to stick up this way. So I mean, I suppose I'll turn these around. I did get another message from another guy, and he said, you know what, I've been racing Pontiacs for 20 years and we always put these down. So he said it doesn't make any difference, but just for the sake of keeping this OEM, I'm probably going to flip these plates around. Okay guys, so I got the lifters in. I wanted to do the rocker arm geometry, but my testing push rod I just discovered is 3/8, and the push rod guides in this are 5/16, and it doesn't fit. So I had to order up a smaller diameter checking push rod, and I'm not going to have that till tomorrow. So So there's not much else I can do. The other thing is I'm finishing the valley pan cleanup. This is the original valley pan. It still needs quite a bit of cleanup, but the only thing I'm concerned about here is I think it's going to interfere with these lifters. Stuff I'm reading says that you can modify this existing valley pan to make it work with these. I may have to do that, or if we can't get that to work, we'll just buy an aftermarket valley pan. I haven't decided yet, but we're gonna get her done. So set up these rocker arms. Do that next. It's actually going to be tomorrow for me, but for you it'll be instantaneous. Okay, so next we got the push rods. What I did is I took an adjustable push rod, like we mentioned earlier, and I put it in here and I checked the rocker arm geometry, and I adjusted the push rod to where our geometry is right where it needs to be. The height, the length of the push rod ended up being 7 inches 800 thousandths. I didn't plan that. It just came out like that. And I got the push rods, and I've got them in, and I've got these two adjusted here. And man, I'm really happy with the way this geometry turned out. About mid-lift, the roller over here was right in the center of that valve, and I did the little ink mark with the sweep, and as it sweeps across, it sweeps right across the center of the valve. So the geometry is really good. The only problem that I ran into here, and it's solvable, if you'll notice, all the push rods are in except for these last 3. So I got 2 boxes of push rods. I opened up the first box, it had 8 push rods in it, so I'm like, okay, great, 2 boxes of 8. Well, now I go to put the push rods in, I open the second box, and there's only 5 push rods in it. I paid for 16, and I got 3 less than I should have. So that's, I guess you got to check everything nowadays. It's hard to get quality parts, and I don't know, it's just crazy the way these parts go for this thing. So now I got to go back and get in touch with that supplier again and say, hey, you shorted me push rods, and hopefully they'll honor that. Not think I'm trying to rip them off, because I wouldn't do that. Anyway, once I get those other 3 push rods, we'll get these the rest of these adjusted up. It's looking really good. Then we get our valley pan in. I may have to modify that valley pan a little bit. Now, Butler Performance does make an aftermarket valley pan that's got more clearance down here. The issue with the stock valley pan, you may find that you have some interference down here with these rollers. It seems like it sits on there, but I'm gonna have to get the valves adjusted and actuate the valve train and actually check the clearance there, make sure they're not hitting on this. Everybody that I've talked to says you got to kind of clearance this thing a little bit. Not much, because it's sitting on there and I don't even have the gasket on it. So these might interfere with the rockers, the lifter tie bars here. Man, I'd hate to put this thing together and have these lifters like tapping on this thing. That would be, I mean, you may not find out that that's happening until you fire this thing up. So I want to make sure I get that clearanced. Either that, or I'll talk to the customer and maybe we'll just buy that aftermarket valley pan instead of using the stock one. I don't know. We're gonna have to work that out. But it's looking good. So I'll get these other push rods. I'll walk you through valve adjustment. I don't want to do it right now because I don't have all the push rods. The other issue here, we got this MSD distributor, right, which is you know, a good distributor. The only other thing is we're going to have to change that gear. So the manufacturer of the cam, the roller cam, and a lot of rollers are like this, says that you can't use the cast iron gear that comes with this thing. I'm gonna have to change that. Man, this gear was expensive. I think he paid like 130 bucks or something for it. And it's like a melanized or a fiber gear or something like that, designed to go with the roller. So that's another thing. You never want to put a cast iron gear on a steel cam like this. Some cams have, like, I know Howard's does some of their cams with a cast iron gear fitted or manufactured into their roller. This particular cam does not, so we're going to have to use this other gear so that this thing will work correctly. Yeah, but that's not a big issue. We'll go ahead and change it and make sure the height is right and everything. We're gonna have to, they put a roll pin in here. You kind of got to drill, and they swedge it. You kind of got to drill the edge of that roll pin out, but I've done it a bajillion times. It's not that big of an issue. So we'll get that done. I'll get the other 3 push rods, and then we'll come back. And the next thing is we'll work out the valley pan issue and get the intake on this turkey. And that's really, I mean, we're very close to this thing being done, so, which is good, because it needs to be done. So I'll get that done and I will be back. All right, so our next order of business on the Pontiac, right where we left off last time, is we're getting ready to adjust these rockers. Now, I've gone through this before, but keep in mind that the roller camshafts have a very specific adjustment. And if you watch the last Ford video I just put up, I did the same thing. So what we're going to do is we're going to start, doesn't really matter what cylinder you start with. This one is right here in the front, so we're going to use it. And we have poly locks on these, which is going to require the use of a wrench and an Allen wrench of the appropriate size. So we're going to rotate the engine and we're going to watch our rockers. So you can see the rockers are rising and falling here. This is my intake valve here, so we might as well start with the exhaust right here. So you're going to watch we'll loosen these up, we don't want these too tight. We're going to watch our intake here. It's going to come up and the intake is going to open, so you'll see the lifter rise. And once that lifter rises to its highest point of travel, so we're still coming up here, we got quite a bit of lift on this cam. So we're going to come up, and as soon as that intake starts to close, we're going to see that start to fall there. We'll make sure we got tension on it. There it goes. It just started to close. What that does is that puts the adjacent exhaust, which is this one here, on its base circle. So we're going to run this down. Now we got to go to 0 lash. This up and down movement, that is lash. I got a lot of lash right there. I've got to get rid of that. So I'm going to run the poly lock down. And you can do that by hand just until we get rid of that lash. So you can see I've got movement here, so I'm going to go down until that movement just goes away. So I literally just pinched the push rod between the plunger and the lifter and the rocker, and I have no up and down movement. Now I can depress the plunger and the lifter, right? That's par for the course. But I just don't, if I grab this, I don't have any movement up and down. There's no slop here. Now if I back it off, you can see I've got slop. So I'm going down until that slop just disappears, right? Don't go any further than that, because then you're going to be depressing the plunger. That's what the adjustment does. So at that point, I'm going to take and I'm going to go about 3/4 of a turn. Because if I go, what I discovered earlier is I ran this down until it bottomed out in the plunger, and it was about 1.5 turns. So we want to be in the middle of that plunger travel. So about 3/4 of a turn is going to be about halfway down. So I'm going to go So I'm going to go 1/2 turn, 3/4 of a turn, which is right there. And that is going to put me in the travel, in the center of my plunger travel. Then we run the poly lock down till it bottoms out. You want to put your wrench on here and you want to tighten these really good. These got to be tight. So we're going to take and we're going to tighten that poly lock, and I'm going to go just a tad more. Make sure that that's tight. And that rocker is now adjusted. You can see I'm in the travel of the plunger, and my roller is located really good because we got the right push rods, and that's how you do it. Now I'll go ahead and do the intake, and I'll show you how we do that. The intake, we're going to watch our exhaust So we'll go ahead and rotate this some more. And the nice thing about the Pontiac is the cam's right here. You can see where those lobes are. So we're going to go ahead and watch our exhaust. We'll be able to see our exhaust lobe coming up, and it's coming around now. So I'm getting close to getting onto my exhaust lobe here, and you're going to see this exhaust lifter start to rise. Okay, just about there. And there it goes. It just started to rise. As I just start to rise on my exhaust, that's going to put my intake here now on its base circle where I need to adjust it. And you see I've got all this lash again. So same thing, I'm just going to run my poly lock down until that lash goes away. I have no up and down movement, right? Some guys will tell you, well, you need to tighten this until you can't spin the push rod. That is absolutely wrong. Because if you do that, it's going to be too tight. Because I can continue to turn this, right, well down into that plunger, and I can still spin that push rod, no problem. That's almost a full turn there, and I can still spin the push rod. And I'm well past the center point of that plunger, so if I go until that stops spinning, I'm going to bottom out these lifters, especially on new lifters that are not pumped up. So that spin method, man, don't do that. That's not, I don't know who came up with that, but that's just nonsense. It just doesn't work. The proper way to adjust a hydraulic lifter is to start at 0 lash. That's right where you just get rid of the up and down movement, or you just touch that push rod between the top of the plunger and the rocker. That's 0 lash. And then we want to get into the middle of the plunger, so we're going to go again. I'm going to go, there's a quarter, there's a half, and there's 3/4 of a turn. So I am now in about halfway down in the travel of my plunger, and then I just run my poly lock down, get it good and tight, and we're in business. You want to get that poly lock tight. You don't want these coming loose. Okay. Those 2 rockers are now adjusted and ready for action. Now I'm going to go through and do every cylinder like that. That's what's required on this. I don't want to do all that on camera. I mean, if you really want to see all 16 of these adjusted, just rewind what I did with these 2 and watch it 8 more times, and you know, enjoy yourself. So I'll get the rest of these adjusted and then we'll move on. Okay, so we've got the rockers adjusted. Everything came out really nice. The geometry came out really good on the rockers. Now what I've done is I took the stock valley pan and I bolted it down because I'm a little bit concerned, well I should say I was a little bit concerned those tall roller lifters might hit this. So I've got this valley pan bolted down snug with no gasket on it. And I've rotated this engine throughout the entire cycle, and there is nothing hitting this pan. Now when I put this on, it's actually going to sit up higher because it's going to have a gasket in here. So just metal to metal sitting here on the block, tightened down, snug. None of the lifters are contacting this. So I think we're okay. I think we're going to be okay on this. If those lifters were hitting that, you'd hear it instead of being turned over. And there's nothing. So I think we're okay. Plus, like I said, the valley pan is actually going to sit up a little higher than this with the gasket. I'm going to go ahead and run this. They do say that with a real high lift cam, you might have contact issues with this valley pan, but you know, the cam in this engine is actually not that crazy. It's not that big. It's actually kind of on the mild side. It's definitely not stock, but it matches these heads pretty good. So yeah, I think we're going to go ahead and put the valley pan on, and we'll move on from there. I'll show you this gasket and the procedure for getting this thing on. Okay, so now you'll notice, guys, when you put this valley pan on, you want to take a thin bead of silicone and put it all the way around where this gasket's going to go. And you want to put this gasket on And let that silicone set up. Let it get to the point where this valley pan gasket is going to stay. I have tried to put these on other ways in the past, and this valley pan gasket wants to slip off of there, and it moves and it causes all kinds of issues. So you want to get this on and just kind of let your valley pan gasket set up for a while. Get it down into that silicone. And we want this, I've just got this sitting on the engine temporarily. And we want to let this set up. Now, one of the issues that we run into here is that sometimes it doesn't want to sit down all the way. Get yourself some clamps or something like this, and just go ahead and just very lightly clamp this gasket on in a few places. And what will happen is it will set up on there. This is just a paper holder. I bought these specifically for doing these gaskets and also doing the Vortec Chevy valve cover gaskets. Same issue here. So go ahead and just clamp that gasket down in various places, and you want to let this set up on there until it actually, you want to let that sealer cure so that this gasket actually sticks to this valley pan. Trust me, you're going to save yourself a lot of trouble here if you do it this way, rather than trying to put the gasket on there and make sure it doesn't slip out. And when you tighten this pan down, it always wants to push out, and it's a problem. So we're just going to get this clamped on here, and we're going to let it sit, and once it sets up, we'll come back and we'll put the pan on. Okay, all right, that looks pretty good. So I'm going to let that sit, and once that sets up, I'll be back. Customer paid for a water pump a long time ago, and I never did pick one up, but I've got one on order and it's supposed to come in. So we're also going to put the water pump on this thing. I need to go get that. So while this sets up, I'm going to go get the water pump, and I'll be back and we'll get this thing on. All right, so I let this sit for a couple hours, and the gasket is nice and snug on there. It's not moving. And also you want to put a thin bead of, just a thin strip of silicone sealer on this gasket. You do not want this valley pan leaking. Trust me, it's going to leak oil. And then of course at that point you're just going to set it straight down on there. Kind of try to nail it because it got sealer on it. Just get it down on where it's going to go. And I've got the intake gaskets on here because I put some sealer on here and kind of try to locate them. This gasket here needs to go underneath of that intake gasket right about there, and it's still able to move a little bit, but it's pretty secure where it's at. And then of course we just want to get our bolts in it, get them started. Then you're going to snug these down. And you want to pull these down evenly. You don't want to pull one side of this down first. And that's basically how you do it. The gasket looks like it's staying in place all the way around. It looks really good. It hasn't slipped. And now we're going to torque these bolts to spec, and you want to run these down evenly. So go ahead and snug them up first, and then we'll get our torque wrench on. And you guys, I like to snug these up with a wrench because I get a better feel for snugging this up. You know, you only got 2 bolts holding this down, and I want to be able to feel how tight this is. And you can feel that as you do this one, the other one will loosen up a little. And you just run them down until you kind of get rid of that looseness. You don't want to over torque these for sure, because that'll make it leak. And then of course we're going to torque it to spec. Okay, that's pretty snug right there. That looks pretty good. And there it goes. I just barely felt it. can hardly tell it's such a low torque. You might want to use an inch-pound torque wrench. I don't have mine here. There it goes. Because somebody borrowed it. But you'll notice that pan is actually, you start to pull it down, the pan flexes a little bit, and that's why it takes a while to get these to snug up. And you'll actually see the gasket start to squish out just a little bit around here, and that is exactly how you want to put that pan on. Don't over tighten these and don't snap them off. Because if you over tighten them, it's going to split the gasket and this thing will leak. So that is valley pan installation. Alright, so the next step is intake manifold, and you can see I've got these studs in here. I'm going to leave the studs in on one side of this, mainly because it does a good job of allowing me to locate it. Now, you've only got one water passage here on the Pontiac, and that is on the front of both sides. And you want to put gasket sealer on both of those. You want, we've got gasket sealer on the bottom of the gasket, and you also want to put some here where this water goes. A little thin layer of silicone and go all the way around that water passage there. We don't want any leaks up here. Anywhere you have water going through to the intake, you always want to use sealer on it. And again, I did put sealer on the bottom of that gasket in that location. So, and then I'll leave these studs in here, and that'll guide our intake on. Now, another word of advice, you guys. Go ahead and get yourself some ARP manifold bolts. Don't use the factory bolts on this thing. They're just, by the time you clean them, and some of them had rust pits and stuff, just go ahead and you're putting a new intake on this, get some new fasteners for it. These were only $15. Spend the money, get something decent. Now, before we put the intake on, the one thing that I would advise, you see, this whole valley pan's been cleaned, but we left this grommet in here for the PCV valve. You want to get that out, and we want to replace that with a new one. Don't leave that old dry rotted grommet in there. I left it in there so I wouldn't lose it, so I could match it up. But now that we've got this on, I can get a tool on that and get that off of there. Got that old PCV grommet out. I had to order a new one, so I'm going to go ahead and put the intake on. It's actually fairly easy to get the new one in there with the intake on. I'm not too worried about it. So, another thing on your intake manifold is there is a crossover water passage into the front cover here. Water goes into this intake manifold. There's a rubber seal that goes in there. We've got that seal on there. We put it on there like an hour ago with silicone on one side. And also put some silicone gasket sealer right there. And that has to be sealed up. And so now we've got our studs in here, and we're just going to go ahead and we're going to get this intake on like so. Just like so. Alright, so now our intake is located. We got our rubber seal in here. We got our studs in here we used to locate. We're going to pull those, but I'm going to go ahead and get some of the bolts started first. We've got our ARP bolt kit. Man, if you're going to buy fasteners, don't mess around with the cheap off-brand stuff. Get yourself some ARP fasteners, and you'll never have to worry about it. They make the best fasteners in the world. And then again on the intake too, guys, is what's really important is you want to get, before you start tightening any of your intake bolts, you want to get all the bolts in and get them started. And one other thing also, make sure you use the washers. This is particularly important on aluminum intakes. Never put a bolt on an aluminum intake without a flat washer on it. And even if it was a cast iron intake, ARP supplies these washers. You want to use those washers. Now they do have ARP lube for a lot of the head studs and stuff. ARP does not require the lube for these intake bolts. I did a little research on them and they said you can run them just like this. So I'm not going to be too concerned about that. Now that I've got the 4 center bolts in, I'm going to go ahead and pull these locating studs out that I put in here. These take an Allen head. I'm just going to go ahead and remove these. And you see this, you can see this open area here. This is where the PCV grommet's going to go when I get it. So you have pretty good access. It's pretty easy to put that in, so I'm not worried about putting the intake on first. Torque on these is 40 foot-pounds, and I've got these to 25, and now I'm going to go to 40 in sequence. We're going to start in the middle here. And then of course we're going to go to the other side. Then we're going to come up to these two. Then we go back here. And then finally back up front. And that is 40 foot-pounds. Also, I would like to remind you that there's this bracket up here with this bolt that kind of holds the intake up to this water cross passage here. 10 foot-pounds on this, and you want to make sure this is torqued before you torque the manifold fully. So this, we've already got this tight. It's this little bracket that holds that in. Once you get that done, just go over them again. Make sure that the manifold didn't settle, and these look like they're all torqued so far. And plus it helps to make sure that you didn't miss anything as well. I mean, I'm pretty sure we didn't, but you always want to double check yourself. Make sure it's double checked 100%. Okay, so the intake is torqued on and we're rolling right along here. So we've got a couple more things that we need to do. I actually need to change the distributor gear before I put that distributor on. I haven't gotten to that yet. And then of course the carburetor, the valve covers and so forth have to go on. We're going to stab the distributor. And then the water pump, I actually had to order the water pump. It's supposed to be here. These dang people are supposed to call me because I want to walk you kind of through how to put the water pump on. There's a little bit of a procedure for that, but it's looking good. So I'll try to get that pump down. We'll come back and button this thing up.